Before we dive in, we have a quick word from our sponsor. Hey listeners, have you heard of Infinite Red? They're a powerhouse in the React Native world, and we're excited to have them as a sponsor for this episode. Since 2015, they've built over 75 apps for companies ranging from startups to global brands. Infinite Red's team of senior developers are the experts you need to build your next React Native app. They're not just about delivering amazing products. They also empower your team by working with your team to share their knowledge. Plus, they're deeply involved in the community, hosting the Chain React conference to over 400 developers and producing the popular React Native podcast. If your company needs a React Native partner, look no further than Infinite Red. Check them out at infinite.red/frontendhh.
On this episode of Front End Happy Hour, I'm sitting down with Emre Baran, co-founder and CEO of Cerbos. With over 20 years of experience in the tech industry, Emre's journey spans from building Turkey's largest social network to his impactful work he's done at Google. Whether you're an aspiring entrepreneur, a seasoned engineer, or someone just trying to scale up a startup, this conversation is packed with insights on leadership, scaling a business, and staying agile in a fast-paced industry. And what you'll hear is, being a CEO often means you're the chief everything officer. So get ready for some invaluable lessons and an inside look at what it takes to build a company and scale it in 2024. Emre, welcome to Front End Happy Hour. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And what your favorite happy hour beverage is? And let's start there.
Cool. I'm Emre Baran. I am the co-founder and CEO of Cerbos. What do I do on a day-to-day basis? I try to be a good CEO and of a growing company, fast-growing company, trying to establish itself in the market, trying to establish a new product in the market of an emerging technology. And my happy hour beverage, lately I've been very much into alcohol-free beer. And I especially enjoy Guinness Zero, and Corona Zero.
How close are they to like your taste, like when you have the alcohol versus the non-alcoholic version?
In my mind, they're very close because I actually also stopped drinking alcohol about 5.5 years ago. So
nice.
I don't have much of a recollection of what it used to taste like, but I'm like, oh, this tastes like what I remember.
You mentioned something that I thought was really funny. I want to dive into. Like, one, I want to know what Cerbos is. Explain, what that is. And actually, maybe let's start there. What is Cerbos and what do you all do?
Sure. Cerbos is a scalable permission management platform. It allows software developers to be able to define and evolve actions for roles within their software. And it allows your end users, product team, security team, and developer teams to ultimately define and evolve actions for each of the roles that you have actually built within your software. It's been referred as external authorization, which is a new up-and-coming field. And at the end of the day, the way that usually developers refer to it is fine-grained access control, without having to build the infrastructure of fine-grained access control yourself.
Which honestly, it's a lot of work to do that. Like in any application, it like starts small and then it's like you keep adding things and it's like it gets very complex. So separating that out and having a service for that, it's music to my ears.
Exactly. It's one of those things we always say every software developer approaches as, oh, I can do that. And yes, they can. With a very simple if then else statement, there you go. You have your permissions like if manager, allow, if not, don't allow. And that if then else statement will take you pretty good way along the way. It will take you pretty far until you have a software that's actually serving enterprises with multiple users in different roles that really have to have those limitations. And suddenly new requirements start coming in from your customers, from your sales team, from product teams. It's like, manager role is great, but we can't have 5,000 managers. That needs to be nuanced. Managers in departments, managers in locations, and suddenly that if then else statement starts getting complex, and suddenly an engineer raises their hand. Oh, we got to refactor this. I'm going to build something that's going to actually scale, so that next time a new requirement comes in, we don't have to write code. Somebody can change a setting, and there are tons of pitfalls of that around performance, distribution, speed, scalability, security, and suddenly it becomes a big task. Suddenly it's no longer three lines of code. It's like you have to have a dedicated team to build it, manage it, scale it, maintain it over time. And the backstory of Cerbos is in our previous jobs, we had to do that 5 to 10 times in different companies, in one company 3 times over 3, 4 years. And every time we're building, it's like, why isn't there something else? Why isn't something
Right.
else? Isn't there something else we can implement and just move on? Because it's an indifferentiated part of the stack. It's kind of like having to build your own database, right? And none of us are in the building of a database business unless you are building databases, right?
Right.
We're all in a business of solving a business problem. Suddenly you find yourself writing a piece of infrastructure to make your product work. And that's exactly what business we're in.
Yeah, I think you said it really well is when I'm building a piece of software, there's something that I'm really focused on. It's like I don't really want to figure out like authentication. It's like that's been solved, right? Like I don't need to go deep and rewrite that. This is another one, having different roles and responsibilities for people. It's like I don't want to have to rewrite that all over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's not an area of passion, right? Like it's not something that I'm like living and breathing all the nuances that go with that make it more scalable, make it more flexible in the system. But now you have a team doing that, right? Like, and you can offload that where they're thinking about that. They're working with other companies that have the same problems. And I think that to me is exactly what I want in something where I don't have to think about much. I can, know that it works, trust it works. People are thinking about it, especially on smaller teams too, right? Like if you're not
Yeah.
a large company that has a dedicated team doing this, it makes sense.
It's usually the journey is like, you build an MVP trying to prove value of your software, and then the end of that journey is going enterprise. But somewhere in between, you have to solve all those things. Like you don't have to be a full enterprise solution, but the moment it's no
Right.
longer MVP, the moment it's addressing businesses that have, tiny bits of inklings of showing of enterprise requirements, these things need to be taken care of.
Yeah. And it's also like you have maybe 10 of those things, not just this. It's like you have 10 of those
Exactly.
things adding up. You're like, oh my God, I'm scrambling to get that going. So, yeah, totally makes sense. Another thing in your intro that really sparked curiosity for me was you saying, I try to be a good CEO. So, what does a good CEO mean? I would love, a definition of what you believe a good CEO does.
Um, the way that I look at the role of a CEO, I also look at my previous companies that I worked in, where I was a co-founder, CTO, etc. A definition of a good CTO or CEO as a co-founder actually changes throughout the life cycle of a company. Right? If you are one of the three co-founders or four co-founders just working in the beginning, the definition of a CTO is, you are the developer, you are the tech lead, you are the architect, you are the VP of engineering, you are the CTO. Or in the CEO case, all of those plus the sales side potentially, or it depends on who else is within the founding team. And, I call my explanation of the abbreviation CEO is, especially in a startup, is Chief Everything Officer, right? Taking care of whatever is not being taken care of in order to get this business forward. Fast forward that in a bigger company, a larger company, what a good CEO is, again, giving direction to the teams, building a good company, building a good team so that everything will be taken care of, and whatever is not being taken care of as a founder CEO stepping in and making those things happen. So, my definition of, let's call it a founder CEO rather than just a CEO, because I'm sure the definition of a good CEO at a IPO company, public company is a completely different story. It's like, that almost steps into Andy grew how high output management. But as a co-founder CEO, I try to be a good CEO and try not to step on too many toes, empower as much as possible, micromanage when it needs to be in the beginning of certain things to just get the spark going, but then be able to step away and enable teams to take over and get the right processes in place and take things forward.
I like that. I really like that you called out the difference almost too, like almost in the company life cycle, is that you're playing different roles. Obviously, as a founder, yeah, like you said, you're playing like everything role, and then slowly you start to delegate that away. But I think that the skills probably change too. Like as a company is, one employee, three employees to 100 employees or to 10,000 employees, that role significantly changes and you kind of have to fit the need of that role as it happens, or you're like, that might not be the thing too, because I've seen some CEOs, they're like, nah, the company's got to this size, that's not really my bread and butter or something that I even enjoy. I'm gonna hand over the reins to someone who takes it that much further.
Yes, I agree in that. And one of the things that actually, years ago, I've discovered somebody called Jimmy Allen who leads the strategy arm of BCG in the UK, and he has a book called Founder Mentality. So ever since I've actually read that, my approach to as a company grows, being a CEO, CTO, VP of engineering, and it's about how you need to be always with a founder mentality in the front lines, and how not to introduce actually middle management and become and get your information through middle management, like how actually executives can always be in the front lines and learn. Because in his book and there's actually a great 20-minute video, maybe we can put them in the show notes, etc. He talks about how companies slow down with additional layers of management. And what that management actually really introduces is information filtering along the ways, and how things actually get lost and all these nuances get lost, and how to overcome that by having a frontline mentality by every executive along the way, so that they're not only getting their information via proxies, but they're actually also firsthand experiencing everything.
I love that, because you're right. Like it starts to, the higher up you go, you're further away from the, like, say like in our world of engineering, it's like you're further away from the actual engineering work the higher you up you go, which makes sense. How do you scale that though too, right? Like how do you think about it as like having touch base with an engineer versus, having touch base with your VPs, directors, et cetera, managers, all that? Like how do you try and figure out how to scale something like that?
I think it actually, funny enough, it starts with being in touch with customers throughout the whole chain, whether it's being in touch with all the employees. Being in touch with the employees is relatively easier. I mean, right now we're small. In my previous company, we have scaled up to like 300 people or so. Within my organization, at some point, I had 60, 80 people. And in early stages, I always had a one-on-one with people. I always, whether it's half an hour or so. And, of course, as a team grows, there aren't enough hours in a week to be able to catch up with everyone. So that became every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks. But nowadays, the way that we actually deal with in a fully remote company is much easier, because we're fully remote, our default mode of communication is asynchronous through Slack or Loom videos. So anything that's one way, it can be a Loom video that's actually published, which takes care of time zones, etc., and where people can actually get to see the update. And then suddenly the time that we have for a catch up becomes any questions that they might have on top of the information that's been already provided. And I've seen that in my previous company as well, where like they're probably already up to date with everything that's going on within the company. And I used to always say, I'm like, look, this is your chance to question me for anything that you're not potentially hearing in the hallways. Ask me things that are happening within the executive meetings. Ask me questions about that are happening in the board meetings. Like, what insight, what additional information can I give you so that you feel well informed about everything that's happening, or you feel well informed about the decisions that are being made.
I like that too, because even as a leader, as I've had more teams under me or something, like I felt the same thing. You start to spread out how many one-on-ones you can have. I think the one-on-one is so important, but the cadence starts to change. Also, what I find myself have have been doing over time is repeating myself, right? You're telling the same, our team needs to do this, our team needs to do this, we need to think about this. And it's like, I loved what you said too, is like, you're basically sharing a video of that and getting people to be like, all right, well, you've got the information. We all have the same information. What kind of questions can I answer? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? And then, so that really helps just get to that conversation a lot quicker versus the like, oh, well, let me explain what we're doing 10 times, like that, or more.
That's exactly. I mean, I see that cadence a lot within Cerbos. We're a fully remote company, where sometimes I repeat myself twice, three times, etc. I'm like, and then you get into a state. I'm like, what have I said? What have I not said? Like what? Because there's no script, right? And like it gets
Right.
lost, at least for me. And the most recent example of this, yes, we do this for company meetings and updates, weekly updates, monthly updates, etc. But the most recent example of this was we were hiring for a director role, right? I was talking to a bunch of candidates, and first 10, 20 minutes of that conversation, talking to the candidates, again, I'm explaining what the company is doing, what the role is about, what we have in place, etc. Which again, halfway through, I start having some mental problems of like, what have I said? What have I not said? Like, am I doing it justice to this role? And after doing the third one, I said, this is it. I actually recorded a loom that explains the role and everything else, and sent that to our recruiter, and our recruiter shared that with all the candidates, so that the conversation as we started is actually jumping into the actual discussion and conversation.
Oh my God. I'm like hearing that. It's so obvious, but I'm just like, wow, I wish I would have done that. The amount of times that I said the same thing over and over again, and especially when you're hiring for a particular role, I think what you had said there too is that you forget, did I tell you this? Like, because I'm
Yes,
like, I know I said it to somebody, but I've talked to like 50 people,
exactly.
and it's like, did I say that same thing? And sometimes I do like the repetitiveness. Maybe it is like doing it 3 times is good because you kind of get a rhythm
You
of
refine it. You refine it. You figure out
exactly.
what the pitch is, but after that, that's like sounds like a broken record, and then broken record in your head is like, oh, did I skip something? Did I say it? It's always a
Yes.
challenge.
Well, I start to, yeah, you feel like a broken record, and I hate that. It's just such an annoying feeling. But then also, you leave out context too, right? Like you
Mhm,
kind of leave out
mhm.
some details that are really important that you're like, oh, I just assumed you had that because you've said it so many times that it's,
Yes.
yeah, I love that. Okay, so cool. Let's get to this remote stuff too. I love that you brought
Yeah.
up the company is fully remote. You all started in 2021, so I'm assuming that there was no question about it because of the pandemic. You had to be remote. And I would love your thoughts on like what were the challenges in early days going like, okay, we have to build a remote company. How did that change your thinking versus like, hey, we're in the office?
So yeah, I mean, the funny thing was we started, as you mentioned, we started March 2021, and my co-founders and I, we weren't more than a couple of miles from each other. Like we used to use one of the parks right between us as a office for to go for walks. But most of the day was actually done remotely from home, and there was no other way. And I actually loved it as at the time bootstrapped startup. We didn't have any funding yet, nothing has been figured out, and I'm like, great, no cost of an office, right? And then whenever you do a budget, it was like, hey, one item is less. And then as we grew, again, there was no end in sight yet, and we started hiring engineers. We started hiring the team around different places. And one of our very first employees, who actually at the time who applied, was living in New Zealand. And we actually, had an active discussion about this. It's like, oh, is this going to be a challenge? Is this a good thing or not? And we actually made the, of course, after the interview and having the conversations, we decided to go with it because it was going to make us a better asynchronous and remote company. A lot of people consider remote when nobody's in the office, but it becomes a much bigger challenge when you're actually across multiple time zones. And being asynchronous forces you to rethink a lot of things like company all hands, for example, right? There's no
Yeah.
it's impossible to have an all hands meeting. And then, which kind of pushed us to think, it was like, what's the point of an all hands when everything is almost like one directional? Yeah, maybe it's a little bit of a motivating factor getting people together, but beyond that, it's actually all about the information that you're relaying, and that's where the beginning of our, looms started. Like, here's the information. I publish it, or each one of the teams publish it as their weekly update, etc. And it's consumed individually. If there are any questions, all of those things happen, etc. So those were, our early challenges. And do I miss an office environment? Absolutely. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we had our offsite, and there were great ideas. There was great conversations being had. There's a lot of serendipity and other conversations happen when you're just not working, like when you're talking to someone, when you're having lunch, or when you overhear a conversation. We try to replicate that as much as possible in Slack. We try to, one of the things that I always say is when somebody actually DMs me on Slack about, it's work topic, I actually say, hey, let's take this to an open channel. Yes, I'm happy to tell you there's nothing private in this. I'm happy to tell you the answer. Let's take this conversation in an open channel so that people have a chance of eavesdropping on this. If they're interested, they can dive into the thread and go through it. If they're not interested, what not? Okay, they can just move on with their life. So the early day challenges were a lot around, how do you get together, how do you brainstorm, etc. But then we were also very small, so it wasn't that much of a challenge. So it's actually a bigger challenge now when you have multiple people and you want to do a brainstorming, but then you don't want to just waste people's time into a brainstorming. In the good old days, it would have been, let's get in front of a whiteboard, but then suddenly it starts becoming much more it starts becoming that we need to be much more considerate about others' times. Also, we're remote and flexible hours in a sense that nobody's guaranteed to be on the other end of the chat if you need it. So it forces us to write better messages with more context and everything else. It changed a lot of our thinking about, okay, where is this person right now? What context do they have? What can we actually provide so that the answer that's coming back is as complete as possible? And it's if you ask me, it's like if we would ever go back to an office right now, I would say probably not for the time being, because this is how we started and how we started making things work. It would be very disruptive to have two classes of citizens where some of them are in an office and some of them are remote. And I completely understand people asking people to, companies asking their employees to come to their office. It makes sense. There's a lot of value to be had. But what's impossible is having some of the staff in the office, some of the staff remotely. Even like when you think about a meeting, right? There's so much more high bandwidth conversation going on in a meeting room, and
Yes.
in pre-meeting and post-meeting. And if you are the remote person, you're not in that whispering conversations. You cannot have those little whispery conversations within the room. B, post-meeting, you're not really having the same level of conversations with people about little things that have been discussed, like any follow-ups, etc. So on that, I'm not a huge fan of hybrid in a sense that where some people are on site, some people are off site, but that's just me. That's just what I've seen from having worked in an office as well as remotely.
I think I'm with you on that too. I've had it in all varying degrees. To be honest though, I don't think I've actually worked at a full remote company, but I can see when I've been on teams that are fully remote and just how that has benefited. Just, it makes things so much easier logistic wise. The hybrid is always the hardest, right? Like your people are feeling left out, whatever it may be. But then even worse is and I have been that person where I was the one person remote, the whole team and everyone was in, and that you feel so lonely.
Exactly. Let me
you feel lonely. You feel like you're missing some of that context. You're just like, and those conversations that you addressed like after the meeting, those are so powerful. Like honestly, I feel like we solve problems that way. too, right? Like there's times where this idea came up, the meeting's done. Like,
Yeah.
like we're humans. We don't like fit it perfectly into, that 30 minutes or hour block or whatever it is. You start having these conversations and you start sparking this idea. And to me, those conversations are ones I don't want to be left out of too, right?
Hmm.
Because that's also being an engineer at heart. I want to solve problems. And I love hearing other people's solutioning and stuff. That happens in meetings, don't get me wrong, but it is those conversations that if you are not there in person that others are having, you get left out. Or the other way around, remote people could be doing that more, right? Like when I'm in the
Hmm.
office, I'm running around to meetings and everything like that. I'm not sitting on Slack. So I miss some of those details.
Yes.
And so I like too that you said I bring some of those, let's just bring this into the public, right? Like let's bring this into a public channel, because that to me is like your water cooler talk in a sense. It's like, oh
Hmm.
yeah, cool. They're talking about that. I'm not that interested. I can just kind of walk past the water cooler, but I might stop because I'm interested in this subject. And like that to me is a really cool way to try and make up for something that might have been left in the office mode.
Let me give you a different example of this from my previous company, where it was four co-founders. We started, four of us, and we grew. Eventually, at some point, our engineering team was 5, 10 people. At the height of it, with product and design, everything, I think we hit 50 or so, 50 or 60, and bunch of early employees, when they were leaving, one of the key things that they mentioned, I was asking, like, why are you leaving? What's led to it? A consistent theme was hearing from them is like, oh, I don't feel like I know what's going on anymore. Which is very normal, right? When it was a small company, we were all in one floor,
Yep.
everybody overheard all the conversations. As we grew, we had offices in, 5, 6 different locations. Even our main office was in 3, 4 different floors. And, people who would early on hear conversations about sales, hear conversations about successes, hear conversations about challenges, don't really know what's going on anymore. So the work that comes their way, they don't really get the context of it. And or if there are some decisions that have been made, they only hear the official line of the decision and why it's been made, but they've never overheard the conversations that led to that. They don't really know whether this was a 5-minute discussion and a decision was made, or it was an ongoing issue, etc. And you know there's a special breed of people who join early companies because they actually enjoy that, what I'd like to call the organized chaos of it. And that doesn't scale. The problem
No.
is that level of conversations doesn't scale. So, one of the hopes that I have with Cerbos, we're right now, 15 people or so. The way that we have it implemented, with the Slack conversations being as much in the open as possible, all the engineering conversations being in GitHub issues, and everything being documented, hopefully that will scale much further, and it will actually leave our company employees much more in the loop about everything that's been happening. So we'll see the scalability of this model hopefully in the next couple of years.
I think you're headed in the right direction. Like to me, it makes a lot of sense, especially as search and things get better and better. Like especially with AI and things like that too. That it's those conversations are documented too, and
Mhm.
so if you can search them easily, like if you guys are 5 years in, let's say, and I come join and maybe a few hundred employees and there's all this data that's built up, if you're able to ask the questions and really get those like real answers, that can be really helpful context to really help do your job too. Is like,
Yeah.
I see how 3 years ago we got to this decision. It really helps paint the picture. And so I think if you have that data built up and that practice of it, it can be really helpful. I think sometimes like one thing I noticed too, that I was earlier at Netflix, obviously it was fairly large, even back, when I had started, it was probably a few thousand people. But what I noticed as it grew and we were, more hybrid, remote type work, is that it was almost overwhelming information. Like there's too much. And so it's really hard to know which information is important for someone and which is not. And so to have those filters, it's really difficult. And so you can have all the information in the world, but it's really hard if you can't parse it in a, not overwhelming fashion.
I mean, what we try on that sales calls and customer calls, what we try to do is we try to record them as much as possible. So
Hmm.
they're available in raw format, but then also when we post them internally, there's like, here are the key takeaways, here are the key things that have been discussed. And, you know, John, this portion might be interesting for you, and try to, record it with the minutes, etc. And then there's at least always the raw information in there. And sometimes, I even come out and saying, hey, do you mind listening to this? Because I probably listened to the customer with happy ears and there are things I'm not catching in here. So it's always a good practice to have that raw information, as well as here's a key piece of information and who should be acting on certain things.
I like that. Yeah, that's, and of course as it scales, hopefully that's just practice, right? Like everyone
Yeah.
kind of does that, and so then you're like circles of people that are doing it and looking out for, John needs this,
Yeah.
and there's other people that are looking out for that. That I could see scale, because it's like you're not doing it all the time. You're not
Mm.
going to go
Yeah.
to John's desk and be like,
Well,
yeah, you
exactly.
need this. Like maybe, but it's like you can't do that
Yes.
with like 500 people.
And going back to your early question, what's the challenge of being a CEO? Is trying to lead by example by implementing these things, and hopefully hoping that people actually pick up on it and repeat it without me actually explicitly saying this is the way to do it. Because I don't know the exact way of doing it. I don't know
Yep.
what's the best method of it. And what I hope is people actually pick up. They always have their own styles adapted to it. And like, so I can, oh, I like what you did there. Maybe I can actually repeat those things as well. But it's trying to get these routines in place as much as possible so that everything is designed for the company's success.
I love that too. I think it's like you as a CEO outline the values of the company, and like,
Mm.
what are things that are important to us as we operate, and information and access to information is important. And so you distill that and make that a practice. Then it opens the door for creativity, right? Is like how people do that. And it might be a Loom video today, but someone might find something that's even better or easier or
Mm.
whatever to streamline that process. You're like, great, like do that. The whole important
Yeah.
thing that I've set out is to share information and make it
Yes.
accessible for people so that they can, get the most information to do their job the best
And
way.
leading by example as much as possible.
Yes. So you've also worked at larger companies, not just being a founder. I saw that you were at Google. What made you decide to leave a large company like Google and go found your own, and
Mm.
do that? Because those are huge differences, and I would just love to hear the transition between those two.
Um, I was lucky enough to be at Google earlier on, where I was part of the Google Ads product team, and there weren't that many of us, and there was a lot of opportunity. And Google always, back then when they hired, especially within the product management, people who were initiative takers, people who could actually, almost operate like a startup within Google. And within Google, I built about 4 different products within the ads group. And, I loved that. It was basically very much so like, hey, I have this idea. I wonder if it will work. And we always all had our, day jobs, but always we're welcome to, come up with new things that we can actually start up. And then, sometimes you get a 20% engineer to start the first versions of it. Sometimes you actually get a team assigned to it. And it was almost like a startup within Google, which was great because you have everything else, right? You have the entire infrastructure set up. And not only that, you have an entire business that's already running with customers and end users. So you're always capable of testing certain things very easily,
Yes.
and be able to see results. And one of the challenges as a startup founder, sometimes you have a new idea, but it's so hard to test that because it's so hard to find people to talk about them and find the relevant people. Whereas when you're at Google, you have billions of users that you can do certain tests on. You have hundreds and thousands of businesses that you can actually talk and start finding their talk about their problems and solutions that you might have to them. And that was always great within Google. But I also uh, feel like once an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur. The moment um, things get a little bit more structured, or there's the moment some walls brick walls start appearing on your path, as an entrepreneur, the natural tendency is like, oh, I can get around that. I can find a way around that. And I have nothing bad to say about Google. Google is still probably light years ahead of any company that's being managed by the same size company, if you compare it, or any company above certain size. But I've hit a couple of those brick walls within Google when I was trying to do something. As Google was also maturing, right? So Google, this was post 2008 crisis. There were certain, structures being put in place so the company is, better managed, etc. And I wanted to do certain things, and it wasn't as easy as it was before. And me and my co-founders, we had a cool idea, and this also corresponded to a time where Hadoop was being open source, so there was a lot of big data technologies that we could actually leverage. We didn't really need Google's infrastructure. This was also coincides with the time where AWS had just started, so we could just hire CPU and compute by the minute. We didn't have to order servers, and high level of infrastructure investment was needed. And we had a business idea around certain things, and again, those entrepreneurial instincts kicked in to go start a company in a specific topic that we wanted to tackle. So that led me to go and again found my own second company at the time, and yeah, it's different. It's absolutely different. I remember first day of walking into the office. Actually, at the time, also moved from New York to London to start the company. We decided to start it in London, both because of certain reasons about where our customer demographics were, etc. But the first day, I still vividly remember lunchtime. Me and my co-founders, we looked at each other and like, what do we do for lunch? Which was never a question before in our lives. Like you just walked into the cafeteria, you ate something. It was like, where do we go for lunch, and where it is? So, and it's completely a different challenge, right? And again, it was great to be within Google's realm, where whenever you wanted something, you could always get it like that because there was somebody to take care of anything you need, or you knew who to talk to. Whereas when you're on your own, it's like, okay, who do we find someone to talk about this? Is suddenly I'm like, nobody realizes that was step one of thinking process, right? Or things around, again, when we look at software infrastructure, various other things, I'm like, suddenly, at the time, there wasn't much JavaScript going on at Google, whereas JavaScript was
True.
booming in the world, and we were like, what is this JavaScript? Do we do it or not? And like suddenly, like being exposed to so many new technologies, so many new frameworks was a very interesting. It was a very interesting experience.
I think that's always kept me interested in JavaScript because of that. It's just like an evolving ecosystem so quickly too. So that makes a ton of sense. Going through being a founder, I definitely get your connection from starting somewhere like Google where you're like, yeah, it basically was building startups within a large company and you just kind of had this backing to kind of just run with something. You're like, I have this idea, I have the data that I can prove this out with. Going into the founder mode side of it outside of something like Google, like what are some of the key lessons like from some of those experiences that you've learned that you kind of reflect back on and maybe have adjusted as you're founding newer companies?
There are lots of key lessons here, but it's number one is data is always hard to find, right? Finding the right data is always is always hard, and many people don't realize you got to work to find that data. Everybody, of course, as a founder, has a hunch, and the founder's intuition, the way that I refer to it, is basically a collection of all your previous experiences and previous conversations you've had, but it's very hard to pinpoint a specific data set as a founder's intuition of like what should be done. And that becomes even harder if you have a team that you need to actually relay that information to. It's like, hey, you can use your social credit a couple of times. Like, trust me, I know this. You can do that once or twice, but after that, you need to be able to do that to show the data. And finding data is very hard as an early stage startup founder, yes, of course you can find some data out there, or you can do a small experiment, small survey, etc. But it's like, how do you prove that you're not listening with happy ears? How do you prove that it's, as early as my previous, I mean, in 2010, you can always ask questions and survey questions to people, but you really don't know in what context they're responding, right? And you need to actually really interview them, get to the details of it. But again, as a small startup, how many people can you talk to and make sense out of that data? And the other thing is, again, a key lesson is very similar to that, is like talking to customers, right? So when you're similarly to data, you're talking to customers, and but how many customers do you have? How many potential customers do you have access to? And not only that, how many customers are just saying that? And how many customers are really willing to buy your product, or willing to put their money down before they talk to you saying that they're going to actually find it? And then third one, I would say key lesson is building always takes longer, especially if you're coming from an engineering background. Um, non-engineering background people can probably put a hack together and show it to customer, and maybe that's the right way of building it. But then the moment you find a fit, you know, us people with an engineering background always want to build it right so that it's whatever we build is going to actually scale. And therefore there's a nice balance to be struck between those two things, but building always takes longer than you predict.
I like that, especially tying it back to the engineering side, because that's something I've been thinking actually a lot about, from just even how leading teams and where should you spend like the extra time on those engineering investments? Like, we all know that there's times where you put something out there early as like a prototype, and if it's successful, that's awesome, but it means that you're refactoring, you're like rethinking. It's like,
You don't, you
it
don't even
got
have to, if it's successful, you don't even have time to refactor that,
no
because
that,
somebody's already trying to sell that to grow the company
yes.
for the next phase. And when do you take that pause to go refactor?
You never do. That's the thing, is like, it's so difficult to do, like, and to say to the business that you're working for, is like, you know what? Yeah, things are working good. We're going to pause on any new features or development. We're actually just going to go
Good luck.
rewrite everything that you see today, but it will scale better. It's like, it has to be done. But I think there is this weird balance of trying to figure out, like, when do you cut corners? And hopefully cut the right corners, right? Like, there's times I want teams cutting corners, because like I've also had teams that were trying to make the perfect thing. And I'm like, who cares? Like, sometimes it's like, if it doesn't get to the point that it needs to be there, then it doesn't matter. Like, you just wasted time, and let's get an early signal. So but there's this weird balance, because they're like, but what if it is successful? Then we're going to have to go back and rewrite all this. And it's like, yeah. So it's a tough one.
This all goes into the whole yak shaving, bike shedding. Yep. Yes. Yagni.
It's never ending. So you're telling me there's no perfect science to this one?
I haven't found it. Maybe somebody that's, more successful entrepreneur, maybe they have a answer to that. But I also believe every company is different. Every product is different. Every interaction of customer's interaction with every product is different. Therefore, it dictates a different dynamic. And, it's a whole different dynamic when you have a massive sales pipeline. Then you can potentially say, pause certain things. You can afford that, time. Versus if you're still in the discovery phase and you're trying to get to a perfect product that's going to actually sell faster, 2x, 3x, 4x faster, you're always chasing that, let's call it a unicorn, trying to perfect your product. Versus when you're Google, the world is a whole different place. So, you can put a team on just building the product or maintaining it as it is, or putting new features on it based on a roadmap, and you can have a whole shadow team re-architecting, re-engineering it, and one day you actually make the switch over to the new system, which, by the way, is another nugget. The biggest time sink in all of this is actually the migration, not writing the new system, not maintaining the old one. It's once you have it, the whole migration, which suddenly involves so many other teams, so much more time, so much more, exception handling or data handling.
Oh man, it's the migrations and those ones when you say about estimating, the estimating a migration is like I don't think I've ever seen it successfully done where it's like it's always really far off and it's like
Yeah.
everyone puts the best intent to it's not just being wildly like liberal on the an estimate be like yeah it's fine we'll get this done real quick. It's like no there's thoughtful thinking that goes into it and then there's like 20 things that people didn't account for that just quickly add up and it's like you see them in hindsight you're like yeah we should have counted for that but that always happens. Maybe before we wrap up, you've given some amazing nuggets of advice, but I would love to maybe just kind of end on like if we have listeners out there who are interested in starting their own company or building out a product from a founder with experience, what advice would you give them?
This is actually one of my co-founders from my previous company has a whole LinkedIn post on this. He's now a VC. You know, we all, especially as engineers, we're all very good at seeing inefficiencies. We're always all very good at building solutions. We're okay, also good at imagining what it could be. But the biggest challenge that a lot of times gets overlooked is what's going to be your product's distribution strategy. And it's funny because I mean, this is a common thing. Maybe we can have a whole different conversation and a podcast session on this. But one of the things that I commonly saw when we were doing our initial fundraising, again, we were lucky. It was COVID times. We actually managed to speak to 90 different investors because everybody was busy. Everybody was bored at home taking calls, right? The
Yeah, that's
VCs
fair.
were all just doing, and in a good old world, it was much harder. You had to go to the VC's office, etc. And suddenly they opened up. And one of the common questions, apart from, why is your product different, etc., that I kept seeing, kept hearing consistently across every single one is, what's your go-to-market strategy? And by that, they mean, how are you going to get distribution? How are you going to, what angle are you going to go to customers that you're just going to convince them to take your product? And how are you going to make that scalable? How are you going to actually get them to hear about your product and say, "Hey, I want that," because that solves a pain. So, if you're starting your own company, the easier part again for people with an engineering background, software background is building the prototype, building the demo, building the product that potentially scales, etc. But all of that is just dry piping unless you're bringing customers into it. And, you know, putting it on Hacker News and hoping somebody will catch on, putting it on Product Hunt, those are, crapshoots. They're not guaranteed. So I would highly recommend to have a very thought out strategy about who you're going to talk, how are you going to get this, how are you going to start this flywheel going, and what's going to be your flywheel, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not just talking to someone, it's like, what do you get out of them, right? Well, how do you get them to be the promoter of your product, the customers or the potential customers that you speak to? So think about, your flywheel and distribution strategy.
I like that a lot too, because yeah, even as you're talking, I'm like, yeah, my head as an engineer thinks about like, oh, I'll build this great product, but it's like, just because you build a great product doesn't mean people are coming to it. Like it's like
Mm,
that takes a lot of work and effort, and that's why there's whole teams around how to
mm,
continue growth of a product.
mm,
So I think that's very good call out, and I love that
mm.
just even through experience. That's the question that keeps coming up. That's what
Yeah,
VC money cares about. So, be prepared to answer that question.
yeah, indeed.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Emery, for taking the time to speak with me. Where can people find you? Where can they get in touch with you if they have questions and want to speak with you?
Oh, thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for hosting me. I am on LinkedIn as Emre Baran, my full name, and on Twitter, X. I don't know if we're still calling it Twitter. Or is it going
I
back to
still do.
Twitter or X? I keep calling it Twitter. I still do as well. I am fortunate enough to have Emre at Emre on Twitter.
That is awesome. I am very jealous of that. I was early on Twitter, but I feel like I used up making some creative name that I didn't like years later. And then by the time to try and get my actual name, it's like, yeah, it's impossible to do. What a great conversation with Emre Baran. We explored his journey from Google to co-founding Cerbos, the challenges of scaling a startup, and the insights on building a product that can revolutionize authentication. His advice of balancing leadership with the technical aspects of running a business is invaluable for anyone in tech. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out from today's conversation? Reach out on social media at FrontEndHH on Twitter or leave a comment on YouTube at FrontEndHH. Plus, let us know what topics or guests you'd like to hear next. As always, thanks for tuning in to this discussion, and we'll see you on the next happy hour.